I am Irfan. Welcome to my detective channel where we explore mystery, crimes, and dark secrets.
Miss Marple and the Festival of the Silent Bell. Chapter 1. The village that would not ring Miss Marple had always believed that the prettiest villages were often the most deceptive. From the train window, Bellwether Saint, Anne looked like the sort of place one found on postcards. A grey church tower rising above red-tiled roofs, cottages with roses still bravely clinging to their walls, and a narrow high street that curved gently towards the village green. There were ribbons tied to lamp-posts, little silver paper bells hanging from shop windows, and children running about with lanterns shaped like stars. It was all very charming, and, thought Miss Marple, very carefully arranged. Her old school friend, Mrs. Edith Lorimer, met her at the station in a small motor car that had seen better days and made no secret of it. Edith was a round, cheerful woman with bright eyes, a soft hat covered in artificial violets, and the sort of warm nature that made strangers tell her things they had no intention of telling anyone. "My dear Jane," she cried, taking both Marple's hands, "you have come at exactly the right time. The whole village is in a state of excitement." "That is usually when people are least sensible," said Miss Marple mildly. Edith laughed. Still the same Jane. They drove slowly towards the village, passing stalls being set up along the green. There were tables for cakes, candles, jam, knitted shawls, and small polished bell charms on ribbons. Yet Miss Marple noticed something curious. Although bells were everywhere as decorations, not one of them made a sound. Even the children's bell-shaped lanterns had their little clappers tied with thread. "How very quiet it is," she said. "That is the point of it," Edith replied. "Today is the Silent Bell Festival. The church bell must not ring until midnight." Miss Marple looked towards the tall square tower of St. Anne's Church. It stood at the end of the green, ancient and stern, as if it disapproved of the cottages for being too cheerful. "An old custom? Oh, very old. Nobody is quite sure where it began. There is a legend, of course. There is always a legend in villages that want visitors." "And what does the legend say?" Edith lowered her voice, though they were alone in the motor car. 100 years ago, a young woman disappeared during the festival. Agnes Pike, her name was. She was last seen near the church. That night the bell rang by itself, though no one admitted pulling the rope. Since then, the bell is kept silent once a year until midnight. Then it rings once to release old sins. Miss Marple's eyes rested on the church tower. Old sins are not usually so easily released. "No, but it makes a good festival. The visitors love it." They reached Edith's cottage, a pretty cream-coloured house with green shutters and a small garden filled with lavender. After tea, Edith insisted on taking Miss Marple round the village. "You must meet everyone before the ceremony. It will help you understand the atmosphere." "That sounds slightly dangerous," said Miss Marple. The green was busy now. Women arranged cakes beneath muslin covers. Men fixed lanterns to wooden posts. The vicar hurried about with a list in his hand, looking like a man who had misplaced both his sermon and his courage. Edith touched Miss Marple's arm. "That is Reverend Seddon. Very kind, very nervous, and quite unsuited to committees." The Reverend Paul Seddon was a thin man with mild eyes and ink on his fingers. He greeted Edith warmly and bowed to Miss Marple. "I hope you will enjoy our little tradition," he said. "I am sure I shall," said Miss Marple, "though traditions can be rather heavy things to carry." He gave a faint smile, but before he could answer, a sharp voice cut across the green. "Reverend, the lantern procession is listed at 7:15, not 7:30. If we are careless with the programme, we may as well abandon the whole affair." The speaker was a tall, silver-haired gentleman in an immaculate dark suit. His face was handsome in a cold, polished way, rather like expensive furniture, in a room where no one was comfortable enough to sit down. Edith's smile tightened. "Mr. Alistair Vale, chairman of the festival committee." Mr. Vale gave Miss Marple a courteous bow, but his eyes had already judged her and found her harmless. "Mrs. Lorimer," he said, "you are late with your flower arrangements." Only by 10 minutes, Alistair. 10 minutes is how disorder begins. Miss Marple, who had seen disorder begin with far smaller things than 10 minutes, said nothing. A young woman came hurrying after him, carrying a box of programmes. She had a pale, pretty face and anxious hands. "My niece, Clara," said Mr. Vale. "Clara, do not crush the corners." "I'm sorry, uncle. You frequently are." The girl flushed. Miss Marple noticed that several people nearby pretended not to hear. That, in itself, was interesting. In a village, people heard everything unless they had trained themselves not to. Near the cake stall stood a square, strong-looking woman tying labels to jars of lemon curd. Edith introduced her as Mrs. Wren. "Best cakes in the county," Edith said. "Best because I don't let fools near my oven," said Mrs. Wren. Her tone was dry, but not unfriendly. "You'll be wanting lemon cake later, Miss Marple. Visitors always do." "How kind," said Miss Marple. Mrs. Wren looked across at Mr. Vale, who was now correcting a man up a ladder. "Kindness doesn't run this festival, fear does." Before Miss Marple could reply, a dramatic voice spoke behind them. "Fear is exactly the proper mood." A thin woman in a plum-coloured cloak swept towards them, carrying a notebook. This was Miss Marian Fleck, the local historian. She had sharp cheekbones, eager eyes, and the air of one who had never met a mystery she could not improve by retelling. "You know the old story, I hope?" she asked Miss Marple. "Agnes Pike, the lost girl, the guilty bell. I shall be giving a short talk before the procession." "Will it be very short?" murmured Mrs. Wren. Marian ignored her. "This village has buried more than bones." Mr. Vale, who had overheard, turned at once. "There will be no sensational nonsense tonight, Marian. History is not nonsense. Your version of it often is." For a moment, the two looked at one another with open dislike. Then Vale moved away, leaving Marian pale with anger. By early evening, the village had changed. Lanterns glowed along the green. Visitors arrived from nearby towns. Children carried silent bells made of paper and silver thread. The church tower stood black against a violet sky. Miss Marple sat beside Edith near the front of the green, knitting quietly. She seemed to be watching her needles, but in fact she was observing the pattern of the village. Mr. Vale moved everywhere, disliked everywhere. Clara followed him like a shadow. The vicar avoided him. Tom Brigg, the church caretaker, glared whenever Vale spoke. Hugh Lorimer, Edith's nephew, appeared charming and restless, laughing too loudly near the candle stall. Mrs. Wren served cakes and watched. Marian Fleck prepared for her speech as if she were about to reveal a national scandal. At 7:15 precisely, the lantern procession began. The village walked slowly towards the church, humming an old tune without words. It was beautiful and rather unsettling. Just before the procession reached the porch, a small boy ran up to Mr. Vale and handed him a folded note. Miss Marple saw Vale open it. She saw his expression alter. Not fear exactly, recognition. He looked quickly towards the church, then towards the crowd. For the first time that day, his certainty seemed to fail him. Without a word, he slipped away from the procession and disappeared through the side gate. The humming continued. The lanterns moved. The bell tower waited in silence. Then, sharp and impossible, the church bell rang. Once, twice, a third time. The whole village stopped as if every heart had been seized by the same cold hand. Edith whispered, "Jane, it isn't midnight." Miss Marple folded her knitting very carefully. "No," she said, and whoever rang it knew exactly what it would do. Chapter 2. The Man Beneath the Bell Tower. For several seconds after the bell stopped ringing, no one moved. The sound seemed to hang above the green like smoke. Children stared at their parents. Visitors looked about for someone to laugh first, but no one did. The older villagers had gone quite still. Their faces wore that peculiar expression people have when superstition, long treated as decoration, suddenly steps forward like a living thing. Then Mrs. Wren said in a voice as flat as a dropped plate, "Well, that's done it. It was enough to break the spell." The crowd surged towards the church. "Keep back!" cried Reverend Seddon, but his voice had no strength in it. Men pushed through the side gate. Women gathered their children close. Lanterns swung wildly. throwing yellow light over gravestones and yew trees. Miss Marple rose more slowly than the others. Edith clutched her arm. "Jane, what can it mean?" "That depends," said Miss Marple, "on whether the bell was rung to summon people or to send them away." They followed at a careful pace. At the church porch, the press of villagers had already become a confused knot. Miss Marple heard someone say Mr. Vale's name. Then Clara Vale gave a cry that was not loud, but terribly thin. Inspector Graves, who had been attending the festival unofficially with his wife, pushed his way through the crowd with practiced authority. He was a square, dark-haired man with intelligent eyes and a manner that suggested he disliked nonsense, but had learned that nonsense often contained evidence. "Stand back, please, everyone outside." "Reverend, keep them from entering." Miss Marple, being elderly and apparently harmless, was not noticed as she came near the open door. From where she stood, she could see enough. The body of Mr. Alistair Vale lay at the foot of the narrow stair that led to the bell tower. His head was turned slightly to one side, his silver hair darkened near the temple. One arm was bent beneath him. His face, once so controlled, had lost all expression except surprise. The bell rope hung some distance away, still trembling faintly. Clara stood by a pew, one hand pressed to her mouth. She seemed unable to look away. "My uncle," she whispered. "Oh, Uncle Alistair." Miss Marple watched her closely. Grief can take many forms, but fear has a sharper outline. Clara Vale looked frightened. Inspector Graves turned. "Who found him?" Tom Brigg, the church caretaker, stepped forward. He was a broad man with weathered skin and large hands. His boots were muddy, his coat rough, and his jaw set hard. "I did. Came in when the bell rang. Same as the rest." "You were inside the church?" "No. Outside by the lantern hooks." "Where outside?" "Near the north wall." "Alone?" Tom's face darkened. "I don't know. It was a festival, wasn't it? People everywhere, Mr. Vale would not have liked that answer, Miss Marple thought. Inspector Graves did not like it much either. Reverend Seddon came in, pale and shaking. "Inspector, surely he must have slipped. The tower stairs are old. I have often said they need repair." "Perhaps," said Graves. "But slipped while ringing a bell before midnight." The vicar looked up towards the tower stairs. "I cannot imagine why he would do such a thing." "No," said Miss Marple softly. "It does seem out of character." Inspector Graves glanced at her. "And you are?" "Miss Marple, I am staying with Mrs. Lorimer." His expression changed slightly. Policemen in country districts often heard names before meeting faces. "Ah, Miss Marple." "Please do not let me interrupt," she said. That was exactly what she had already done, but so gently that no one could object. Inspector Graves knelt by the body. "No one touches anything. Where are his gloves?" Clara blinked. "His gloves?" "He was wearing gloves earlier. Black leather." "Yes," said Clara slowly. "He always wore them in the evening." He said his hands got cold. "They are not here." A small murmur travelled through those nearest the porch. Miss Marple's eyes moved from Mr. Vale's bare hands to the bell rope. The rope looked old and dusty, with a grey film on its twisted fibres. Yet Mr. Vale's fingers were clean, very clean, too clean for a man who had just pulled a neglected church rope. She noticed something else. His coat carried a faint scent, not of damp stone or church dust, but of candle wax. Inspector Graves stood. "Reverend, was the tower locked?" "The upper door is usually locked, yes. The lower stair is open. Tom has the key. So do I." "And Mr. Vale?" The vicar hesitated. Tom Brigg gave a bitter laugh. "Mr. Vale had keys to everything. Thought he owned the place." "Did he?" asked Graves. Tom looked at him. He liked people to think so. That was unwise. Everyone in the porch felt it. Outside, the crowd had become louder. Rumour was waking up. One woman was saying it was Agnes Pike's bell. Another said she had seen a shadow in the tower window. A man insisted the tower door had been locked all evening. 3 different people claimed they had been standing in the exact place from which they could see everything, though none of them had seen anything useful. Marion Fleck appeared at the entrance, her plum-coloured cloak clutched round her. Her face was alive with horror and excitement. "I knew it," she said. "I said old guilt would rise." Inspector Graves looked at her coldly. "Did you?" "I warned them not to mock the legend." "Nobody has been murdered by a legend, Miss Fleck." The word murdered changed the air. The vicar made a small sound. Clara sank onto a pew. Tom Briggs' eyes narrowed. "Murdered," Edith whispered behind Miss Marple. Inspector Graves did not answer directly. Mr. Vale did not ring that bell after falling. Whether he fell or was made to fall remains to be seen. A young constable arrived, breathless, and began moving people back from the porch. Inspector Graves ordered the church cleared. Before Miss Marple stepped away, her gaze fell on a small square of paper near Mr. Vale's waistcoat pocket. It was half tucked inside, as if pushed there carelessly. Graves saw it too. He took it out with a handkerchief and unfolded it. The writing was plain, careful, and without signature. "Before the bell rings, tell the truth." Clara gave a little gasp. Inspector Graves looked round the church. "Has anyone seen this before?" No one answered. Miss Marple did not look at the note for long. She was watching faces. The vicar looked bewildered. Tom Brigg looked angry. Marian looked triumphant, in spite of herself. Clara looked as though the words had struck her personally. And Mrs. Wren, standing just beyond the porch with a tray still in her hands, did not look surprised at all. She looked tired. Outside, the crowd separated into clusters. The festival lanterns continued to glow absurdly, making the churchyard almost pretty. The little silver bell charms at the stall fluttered in the evening breeze, silent and shining. Inspector Graves came out a few minutes later. "No one is to leave the village tonight. I shall need statements from everyone connected with the festival committee." "That will be nearly everyone," murmured Edith. "Then nearly everyone must be patient." Miss Marple turned once more towards the tower. High above them the bell sat unseen in its dark wooden frame. It had rung before midnight, and the village would remember that long after it forgot the exact hour of Alistair Vale's death. Edith slipped her arm through Miss Marple's. "Jane, you look troubled." "I am. Because of the note, partly because of the bell." "No," said Miss Marple, "because of his hands." Edith stared. "His hands? So clean," said Miss Marple, "and yet the rope was so very dusty." The wind moved softly through the yews. Somewhere behind them, a child began to cry. Miss Marple looked at the church door, then at the lantern-lit green where the villagers whispered beneath paper bells. "How very clever," she said quietly, "and how very wicked." Chapter 3. Lanterns, Lies, and Lemon Cake. By breakfast the next morning, Bellwether St. Anne had stopped pretending the festival was merely interrupted. It had become, in the village mind, a murder. The word travelled faster than any official statement could have done. It passed over garden walls, through shop doors, across breakfast tables, and into the churchyard, where two elderly men stood looking up at the tower, as though expecting it to explain itself. Mrs. Edith Lorimer poured Miss Marple a second cup of tea with a hand that was not quite steady. "I slept very badly," she confessed. "Every time I closed my eyes, I heard that bell. A sound heard at the wrong time is often more disturbing than a louder one heard properly," said Miss Marple. Edith gave a faint shiver. "You do say the most unsettling things in such a gentle voice. I am sorry, dear." "No, you are not," said Edith, and for the first time that morning she smiled. After breakfast, Miss Marple suggested a short walk to the green. Edith understood at once that this was not for exercise. The festival decorations remained in place, but they had lost their gaiety. The ribbons looked limp. The lantern poles leaned slightly in the morning breeze. A few visitors had already left, though Inspector Graves had asked that anyone closely connected to the festival remain available. It gave the village the strange appearance of a party abandoned after a quarrel. Mrs. Wren was at her cake stall, though there was no reason for her to be there. She was wrapping leftover cakes in brown paper and tying the parcels with string. "You are very industrious," said Miss Marple pleasantly. "Waste is a sin," replied Mrs. Wren. Murder doesn't improve stale cake. Edith made a small shocked noise, but Mrs. Wren only tightened a knot. "Did you sell many cakes last night?" asked Miss Marple. "Enough. The lemon ones were very popular, I suppose." Mrs. Wren glanced at her. "Always are. Lemon wakes people up. Too much sugar sends them soft in the head." Miss Marple looked at the neat rows of wrapped parcels. "Were you at the stall when the bell rang?" "I was, serving Mr. Pritchard 2 slices of ginger loaf." "Then you must have seen how people moved." "I saw a crowd panic, same as anyone." "Did Mr. Vale pass this way before he went to the church, Mrs.?" Wren's hands stopped for the smallest possible moment. "Mr. Vale passed everywhere. That was his habit. But shortly before the bell, he crossed the green. He had a face on him like thunder. Alone, as far as I saw." There was something firm in that answer. Not false, perhaps, but placed carefully like a vase near the edge of a table. Edith leaned closer to Miss Marple when they moved away. "Do you think she knows something?" "My dear, in a village everybody knows something. The skill lies in knowing whether it is the something that matters." Near the church porch, a constable was keeping away the curious. Inspector Graves stood speaking with Reverend Seddon, whose face looked greyer than it had the night before. The inspector bowed slightly when he saw Miss Marple. "Good morning. I had a feeling I might find you near the church. And I had a feeling I might find you looking rather dissatisfied," said Miss Marple. "I am always dissatisfied when a dead man leaves me with too many helpful villagers." "That is understandable." Graves glanced towards the tower. Mr. Vale was struck before he fell. Doctor's view is that the blow caused death or unconsciousness. The fall may have been arranged afterwards to suggest accident. "Or to place him near the bell," said Miss Marple. "Exactly. Yet the bell rope could not have been pulled by him. You were right about the hands." No dust. Miss Marple accepted this without pride. "Were his gloves found?" "Not yet." "And the note?" "No one admits recognizing the handwriting." "That is a very common village illness," said Miss Marple. "Sudden blindness in the presence of handwriting." Inspector Graves almost smiled. "The caretaker is our strongest lead. He had access to the tower, quarrelled publicly with Vale, and cannot produce anyone who definitely saw him at the crucial moment." "Poor man." "You think him innocent. I think him angry. It is not the same thing." Inside the church, Reverend Seddon sat heavily in a pew. He looked up when Miss Marple approached. "I keep wondering whether I should have cancelled the festival years ago," he said. "These old customs stir people up." "It is not usually the custom that is dangerous," said Miss Marple. "It is what people put inside it." The vicar rubbed his forehead. Mr. Vale was not an easy man, but he worked hard for the village. People often work very hard at controlling what belongs to others. He looked startled, then quickly away. Miss Marple noticed that too. Outside again, a small object near the church porch caught her eye. It lay half hidden between 2 flat stones, dull silver against damp moss. Miss Marple bent slowly and picked it up. It was a broken bell charm, older than the bright new ones sold at the stall. The little loop at the top had snapped. On one side were faint engraved initials. A.P. Edith peered at it. "Agnes Pike, perhaps," said Miss Marple. "Or perhaps someone hoped we would think so." Before Edith could answer, Marion Fleck came hurrying across the green cloak flying behind her like a wounded flag. "There you are," she cried, as though Miss Marple had been hiding from history itself. "I must speak with someone sensible." "Then you have chosen kindly rather than accurately," said Miss Marple. Marion did not notice. "This is not merely about Alistair Vale. It is about the old scandal. I told him not to suppress what I had found." "What had you found?" asked Edith. "A diary. Not Agnes Pike's own, but belonging to a woman who knew her. There are references to the night she vanished. Hints of a child, a family secret, a payment made. It changes everything." "Where is this diary now?" asked Miss Marple. Marion's expression faltered. "That is the trouble. It has gone, stolen, from my desk, yesterday evening, before the bell rang." Inspector Graves, who had come within hearing, looked sharply at her. You did not mention that last night. I was distressed. You were talkative. Marian flushed. I did not realize its importance until later. Miss Marple thought that unlikely. Marian Fleck realized the importance of things before they had any. A shout came from the direction of the inn. Hugh Lorimer emerged, laughing too loudly with a young man Miss Marple did not know. His hat sat at a careless angle, and his smile vanished the moment he saw Inspector Graves. Edith sighed. That boy. He has always had more charm than judgment. Was he very close to Mr. Vale? Asked Miss Marple. No, he asked him for help once, I believe. Money trouble, Alistair refused. Rather cruelly, from what I heard. Hugh approached them with exaggerated brightness. Aunt Edith, Miss Marple. Dreadful business, what? Very dreadful, said Miss Marple. Police everywhere. Makes a man feel guilty for breathing. Does it? He laughed, then looked away. Miss Marple saw a faint tremor in his fingers as he took out a cigarette. Inspector Graves asked, Where were you when the bell rang, Mr. Lorimer? Fetching a lantern for my aunt. Edith blinked. Were you? Hugh turned quickly. Yes, you remember. You said your lantern had gone out. I remember saying it was dim. Same thing, surely. Not at all, thought Miss Marple. A little later, as the village slowly returned to its disturbed business, Miss Marple and Edith made their way home. At the corner near the post office, Clara Vale stood alone, speaking to no one. She looked exhausted. Her black dress was too severe for her young face. Miss Marple paused. My dear, I am very sorry. Clara looked to her with sudden, desperate eyes. He was not always cruel. No, said Miss Marple gently. People seldom are. That is what makes cruelty so confusing. Clara's lips parted as if she might say more. Then she saw Marian Fleck across the green and closed herself up again. I must go, she whispered. That evening, Edith and Miss Marple were sitting by the parlour fire when a sharp knock came at the door. It was Clara, pale and shaking. Someone was outside my window, she said. Someone whispered to me. What did they say? Asked Edith. Clara swallowed. They said, You know what he did? Miss Marple looked at the girl's trembling hands, then at the dark window behind her, where the reflection of the fire shook faintly on the glass. And do you? She asked softly. Clara's face once went white. Before she could answer, the church clock struck 9. No bell rang, but in that silence, the question seemed louder than any bell could have been. Chapter 4. The old story beneath the new one, Clara Vale, did not answer Miss Marple's question. Instead, she lowered her eyes and twisted her handkerchief until it became a damp little rope between her fingers. For a moment, Miss Marple thought the girl might faint again, but Clara steadied herself with a visible effort. I don't know what it meant, she said. It was not a convincing lie. It was not even a well-practiced one, but it had the miserable sound of a person who wished it were true. Edith drew her gently towards the chair nearest the fire. Sit down, child. You are frozen. I should not have come, Clara whispered. If Uncle Alistair knew. Then she stopped, remembering that her uncle could know nothing now. Miss Marple leaned forward with her knitting resting in her lap. Did your uncle keep papers at home, my dear? Clara's frightened glance was answer enough. Letters, perhaps? Accounts? Old family documents. He kept everything, Clara said. Receipts, notes, invitations, even envelopes if he thought the address might be useful one day. He said careless people left evidence everywhere. How sensible of him, said Miss Marple, and how very inconvenient for careless people. Clara looked as though this simple remark had struck too near something hidden. She stood abruptly. I must go back. Please forget I came. That is not always easy, said Miss Marple kindly, but I shall not repeat it unnecessarily. After Clara left, Edith sat very still. Jane, you think that poor girl knows something. I think she is afraid of knowing it. Is that different? Oh, yes. Quite different. Many people can keep a secret if they believe it belongs to someone else. The next morning, the village woke beneath a low grey sky. A damp mist lay over the churchyard and softened the shapes of the gravestones. The silver bell charms hanging from the stalls had collected tiny drops of water so that they seemed to weep without making a sound. Miss Marple asked Edith to take her to Marian Fleck's cottage. Marian lived at the far end of the village in a narrow house with a crooked chimney and windows crowded by stacks of books. Inside, the parlour looked less like a room than an excavation. Papers lay in heaps on chairs, tables, and even the floor. Old parish maps were pinned to the walls, a framed sketch of St. Anne's Church hung above the mantel, with the bell tower drawn rather larger than seemed natural. Marian received them with dramatic gloom. "I suppose Inspector Graves has sent you," she said. "Not at all," said Miss Marple. "I came because I am interested in old stories." Marian brightened at once. "Then you are unlike most people here. They like the festival, but not the truth behind it. Truth is often less decorative than tradition." "Exactly." Marian swept a pile of newspapers from a chair and invited Miss Marple to sit. Agnes Pike was not merely a poor village girl, as they say in the programme. She was connected to the Bellwether family. There was money involved, possibly a child, certainly disgrace. Edith looked uncomfortable. "Marian, you must not build castles out of parish dust. I build nothing. I uncover." Marian crossed to a desk and opened a drawer. It was empty. She stared at it with renewed indignation. "The diary was here. I am certain of it." "When did you last see it?" asked Miss Marple. "Yesterday afternoon before the procession. I went to check the wording of my speech. Then I left for the green. When I returned after the murder, it was gone." "Was the cottage locked?" Marian hesitated. "The front door sticks. I sometimes leave it on the latch." Miss Marple nodded. In villages, locks were often treated like umbrellas. Everyone agreed they were useful, but many forgot them until trouble had already arrived. What exactly did the diary say? Marian drew herself up, clearly enjoying the importance of the moment. It mentioned Agnes meeting someone by the church on the night of the festival. It also said the bell rang, and Mrs. B wept as though the dead had spoken. Mrs. B? Probably Mrs. Bellwether. The family owned half the land then, and Mr. Vale knew of this. I told him. He ordered me not to include it in my speech. He said the festival was for visitors, not scandal. Did that anger you? Of course it angered me, but I did not kill him for being small-minded. No, said Miss Marple. Small-minded people would be much fewer if that were common. Marian gave her a sharp look, unsure whether she had been insulted or agreed with. As they left the cottage, Edith whispered, "Do you believe her? I believe she had a diary. I do not yet know whether the diary had the truth." At the church, Inspector Graves was questioning Reverend Seddon again. The vicar looked more worn than ever, his collar slightly crooked and his eyes ringed with sleeplessness. The committee argued about the church land. Graves said when Miss Marple joined him. Vale wanted to lease part of it for new cottages. Seddon opposed him. It would have brought money, the vicar said weakly, but it would also have disturbed the old burial ground. And Mr. Vale threatened to expose a mistake in your accounts, Graves added. The vicar flushed. Not theft. Never theft. I moved money from one repair fund to another. I meant to correct it. Alistair made it sound criminal. He had a talent for that, said Miss Marple. Inspector Graves looked towards the tower. Tom Brigg knew about the quarrel. Clara knew about it. Half the committee may have known. And half the village would know by tea, said Miss Marple. At that moment, a group of children ran across the green carrying their festival craft entries. Paper lanterns, painted wooden bells, and little toy towers. One small boy, proud and gap-toothed, showed another how his cardboard bell could be made to ring without touching it. He had tied thread through a hole in the back and pulled it from behind his coat. The other children laughed. Miss Marple did not. She watched the thread vanish beneath the boy's sleeve and then looked up at the real tower. Inspector Graves noticed. Something? Children are very instructive, she said. He sighed. I was afraid you would say that. Later that afternoon, the missing diary was found, or rather, part of it was. A constable discovered several torn, mud-stained pages near the low wall behind the churchyard. The cover was gone, so were many pages. Marion Fleck identified the handwriting and nearly wept with rage. "Ruined! Absolutely ruined!" Inspector Graves studied the fragments. "Conveniently found." "Convenient?" cried Marion. "This is destruction." "Yes," said Miss Marple, looking at the torn edges, "but not very careful destruction. The pages were wet, but not soaked. They had been placed where they would be found, not lost there in panic. One sentence remained clearly visible. The bell was silent until someone wished it otherwise. Marion declared this deeply significant. Inspector Graves declared it useless without context. Reverend Seddon looked as if he wished both history and murder would go away and leave him with ordinary parish complaints. By evening, the doctor's report had reached Inspector Graves. He came to Edith's cottage just as Miss Marple was arranging her knitting needles beside the lamp. "Mr. Vale did not die from the fall," he said without preamble. "He was struck before he reached the stairs, a heavy blow to the head. He may have been dead before he was placed beneath the tower." Edith put a hand to her mouth. "So," said Miss Marple quietly, "the bell did not announce an accident." "No," said Inspector Graves. "It announced a performance. Outside, the village lay in unnatural silence. No children played in the lane. No one sang in the inn. Even the dogs seemed to bark less than usual." Miss Marple looked through the window towards the dark shape of the church tower. "A performance," she repeated. "Yes, and performances are made for an audience." The question, though she did not say it aloud, was whether the audience had been meant to look at the body, or away from something else entirely. Chapter 5. The Wrong Suspect. By the following morning, Bellwether Saint. Anne had divided itself into two groups. Those who believed Tom Brigg had killed Alistair Vale, and those who said they had always known Tom Brigg would kill someone eventually. This second group was the larger. Miss Marple found that very sad, though not surprising. A man with muddy boots, a loud voice, and a temper was far easier to imagine as a murderer than a tidy, quiet person with clean fingernails and a respectable stall at the village festival. Tom himself was discovered in the churchyard, shortly after 8 o'clock, standing near the tower door with a spanner in his hand. He claimed he had come to check the old hinges, which had been damaged during the police search. Unfortunately, no one had asked him to do so. Inspector Graves did not like this. "You were warned not to interfere with the church," he said. Tom's weathered face darkened. "I weren't interfering. I've cared for this church 30 years. Longer than some folk have cared for anything except their own pockets. You quarrelled with Mr. Vale. So did half this village. You had access to the tower. So did the vicar. So did Vale. So did anyone who knew where the spare key was kept." Inspector Graves became very still. "And where was it kept?" Tom realised too late that he had said more than he intended. "I don't know now, but you did know." Everyone on the committee knew, behind the loose stone under the north window. Foolish place, but there it was. That changed matters. It widened the circle, but it did not help Tom. In village investigations, Miss Marple had often observed. Information that ought to make many people suspicious usually made one person look more suspicious instead. The decisive blow came an hour later. A constable searched Tom's tool shed behind the church cottage and found a pair of black leather gloves wrapped in newspaper beneath a broken flower pot. They were identified at once as Mr. Vale's. Clara recognised them. So did Reverend Seddon. A smear of darkened wax marked one cuff. Tom looked at the gloves as though they were alive. "I never put them there." Inspector Graves said nothing for a moment. That was worse than speaking. "I never put them there," Tom repeated louder. Mrs. Wren, who had appeared at the edge of the churchyard with a basket over her arm, gave a dry little sniff. Shouting never improved truth. Tom turned on her. "And you'd know all about truth, would you?" Her face hardened. "I know enough not to threaten dead men in public." Tom made a step towards her, but the constable caught his arm. It was unfortunate. It made him look exactly as people already believed him to be. By noon, Tom Brigg had been taken away for formal questioning. The village exhaled. There is always comfort in having a suspect. It allows ordinary people to return to ordinary things, while telling themselves that danger has been neatly labelled and removed. But Miss Marple was not comforted. She and Edith sat in the parlour after luncheon, the fire burning low, though the day was not very cold. Edith had been quiet for some time. "Jane," she said at last, "Tom is rough, but I cannot quite believe it. No, you agree?" "I agree that he is rough." Edith looked at her. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "My dear, I have known several rough men who would break a chair in anger, but never plan a murder. Planning requires a different sort of temper. And the gloves? Planted things are often too neatly planted." That afternoon, the village made a brave attempt to resume parts of the festival. The committee said it was for the sake of the visitors, but there were hardly any visitors left. The children's craft table reopened. The church flower display remained closed. Mrs. Wren sold tea and cake from her stall, saying that people must eat whether murder had occurred or not. Miss Marple bought one slice of lemon cake. It was excellent, Mrs. Wren watched her take the first bite. "Well, very good indeed," said Miss Marple. "Still quite fresh. I bake properly." "Of course." Mrs. Wren began wiping crumbs from the counter. "They've taken Tom, I hear." "Yes. Can't say I'm shocked." "No, he had a grudge. Men like that carry grudges like knives." Miss Marple folded her napkin. "Women carry them too, sometimes, Mrs. Wren looked up. "Women carry them longer. We have better pockets." It was said almost humorously, but there was no humour in her eyes. Across the green, Marion Fleck stood speaking to a small group of villagers. Her plum cloak had returned, and with it her appetite for attention. Miss Marple could hear fragments of her voice. Agnes Pike, hidden bloodline, the bell knew. Inspector Graves approached before Marion could gather too large an audience. "Miss Fleck," he said, "I would prefer you not to inflame the village with theories." "Theories?" Marion cried. "Inspector, if you had read what I had read." "But I have not, because your diary has vanished, reappeared in pieces, and tells us very little except that someone in the past was upset by a bell." Marion flushed. "You will be sorry when the truth emerges." "People often tell me that," said Graves. "They are rarely correct." Miss Marple almost enjoyed him for a moment. Near the post office, Clara Vale stood alone, watching the exchange. She looked thinner, as if the last 2 days had taken something physical from her. Hugh Lorimer joined her briefly. Whatever he said made her turn away sharply. Edith noticed. "Hugh is not himself. Was he ever very reliable?" "No," Edith admitted, "but he was kind as a boy." "Kindness in childhood is a promising beginning," said Miss Marple. "Not always a lasting achievement." Before Edith could answer, Marion Fleck strode past them with trembling dignity. "They laugh at me now," she said, "but tonight I shall make them listen." "Tonight?" asked Miss Marple. "At the memorial gathering. Reverend Seddon has agreed to a short address before prayers. I shall say what must be said." "Do be careful," said Miss Marple. Marion gave a dramatic smile. "My dear Miss Marple, truth is never safe." That was one of those remarks, Miss Marple thought, that sounded splendid and meant almost nothing. At dusk, Marion Fleck disappeared. At first, no one was alarmed. Marion was theatrical enough to be late for her own rescue. But when Reverend Seddon delayed the memorial prayers and she still did not arrive, Inspector Graves sent 2 constables to her cottage. The front door stood open. Inside, one chair had been overturned. Papers lay scattered on the floor. There was no sign of Marion. The search spread quickly. Men took lanterns to the lanes. Women called her name from doorways. The old well beyond the churchyard was examined with great care. Near its broken stone edge, they found Marion's plum-coloured shawl caught on a thorn branch. Edith turned pale when she heard. "Not another death?" "Perhaps not," said Miss Marple. "How can you say that?" Miss Marple was looking at the shawl, which Inspector Graves had allowed her to see. The tear in the fabric was long and clean, not jagged as it would be if pulled from someone struggling among thorns. More curious still, near one corner was a pale smear. Miss Marple touched it lightly and rubbed it between finger and thumb. Flour. Inspector Graves watched her. "Well, I think," said Miss Marple, "that Miss Fleck may be in less danger than she wishes us to believe. You think she staged this? I think someone staged it. Marian may have helped, or she may have been persuaded." "Persuaded by whom?" Miss Marple did not answer at once. She looked across the green towards the cake stall, closed now, but still covered with its neat white cloth. "Inspector," she said, "do you know whether Mrs. Wren makes her lemon cakes in the morning or the night before?" Graves frowned. "Is that important?" "It may be." Edith stared at her. "Jane, what have cakes to do with a vanished woman?" Miss Marple smiled sadly. "My dear Edith, in village life, cakes have to do with almost everything." Chapter 6. The midnight ceremony, Marian Fleck was still missing when evening fell. By then, Bellwether St. Anne had become a village of lowered voices and half-open curtains. People who had once moved freely across the green now hurried from one door to another, as if the open air had become unsafe. The little silver bell charms still hung from the stalls, but their brightness had turned mocking. What had seemed quaint 2 days before now looked like a row of tiny warnings. Inspector Graves had ordered another search of Marian's cottage. Nothing useful had been found except more scattered papers, a cracked teacup, and a great many underlined sentences in old parish books. The overturned chair looked dramatic but not convincing. Miss Marple had seen real violence in rooms before. It left a different feeling behind. Still, Marian herself was nowhere to be seen. At Edith's cottage, the lamps had been lit early. Edith moved restlessly between the parlour and the kitchen, unable to settle. "I never liked Marian's manner," she said, "but that does not mean I want the poor woman lying at the bottom of a well." "No," said Miss Marple, "disliking people is quite different from wishing them harm, though some people confuse the two when it suits them." Edith paused by the window. "Do you truly think she staged it?" "I think the shawl was meant to be found. But why? To make us look in the wrong direction? Or to make one person look especially guilty? Or perhaps to frighten someone who knows too much?" Edith shivered. "This village has become horrible. It may always have had the necessary ingredients." Miss Marple said gently. "The murder has merely stirred them." A knock came at the door. Clara Vale stood outside, wearing a dark coat and no hat. Her face was white with cold, but Miss Marple suspected the cold was not only from the weather. "May I speak to you?" she asked. Edith began at once with kindness. "Of course, my dear. Come in. You must have tea." "No tea, please. I cannot stay." Miss Marple studied the girl's hands. They were clenched so tightly that the knuckles had lost colour. "You have remembered something?" Miss Marple asked. Clara looked towards Edith, then back again. "I do not know if it matters. Things that trouble us usually matter, though not always in the way we expect." Clara stood near the fire but did not sit. "My uncle was going to make an announcement after the festival. He told me so. He said there were people in this village who had been smiling at him while cheating him. Cheating him personally. No, the festival committee, I think. The accounts. He had been looking through them for weeks." Miss Marple's expression did not change. "Did he name anyone?" "No. He enjoyed making people wait. He said fear was more useful when it had time to grow." Edith gave a small sound of disgust. How cruel. Clara's mouth trembled. "Yes. But he was not wrong about everything. There was something wrong with the money. I saw columns in his account book marked with red pencil." "Where is that book now?" "I do not know." Clara lowered her voice. "I looked for it after he died. It was gone." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "And the key you hid?" Clara started. "How did you?" "My dear, when a young woman says she knows nothing, and then guards her sewing basket as if it contains crown jewels, one is inclined to wonder." For the first time Clara almost smiled. It vanished quickly. "It was the key to my uncle's desk," she said. I found it on the carpet in his study after the murder. I thought if the police found it, they would think I had been searching his papers. Had you? Yes. There was silence. Clara looked as if she expected judgment. Miss Marple gave her none. I wanted to know what he had meant, Clara continued. About people cheating him. I found letters, but not the account book. Some of the letters were from Hugh Lorimer, asking for money. Some were from Reverend Seddon about the land. There were notes about Tom Briggs' cottage, and there was one envelope with no letter inside. Whose writing was on the envelope? Clara hesitated. Before she could answer, footsteps sounded outside. She stepped back from the window as though afraid of being seen. I must go. Clara, said Miss Marple quietly. Was the empty envelope from Mrs. Wren? The girl stared at her. That was answer enough. A moment later she fled into the evening. Edith turned slowly. Mrs. Wren? Jane, do you suspect her? I suspect, said Miss Marple, that she is being very careful. Careful people are not always guilty, but they are often worth watching. The midnight ceremony had been the subject of argument all day. Many villagers wanted it cancelled. Others insisted that cancelling it would be worse, because the bell had already been broken from its tradition. Reverend Seddon, exhausted by grief, fear, and committee pressure, finally agreed that the ceremony would take place under police supervision. It is madness, Inspector Graves told Miss Marple outside the church at 10 o'clock. But madness with half the village attending. At least I can keep an eye on them. Sometimes a public gathering is useful, said Miss Marple, for catching murderers, for making them nervous. The churchyard filled slowly. No festival music played now. No children carried lanterns. The villagers came wrapped in coats and silence, their faces lit by the lamps placed along the path. The old superstition had returned in full strength. Even those who claimed not to believe in it kept glancing towards the tower. Tom Brigg was still in custody, but his absence did not settle matters. If anything, it made people more uneasy. A convenient suspect was comforting only while nothing else happened. Marion Fleck remained missing. Hugh Lorimer stood beside Edith, his handsome face pale and strained. He had not shaved properly. You look ill, Edith whispered. Didn't sleep. Have you spoken to Inspector Graves? Why should I? Because you vanish at unfortunate times. His eyes flashed. Aunt Edith, for heaven's sake. Miss Marple, standing close enough to hear, looked at him with mild interest. Where did you fetch the lantern from on the night Mr. Vale died? Hugh blinked. What, the lantern? For your aunt. From the stall, I suppose. You suppose? It was all confusion. But the confusion began after the bell rang. You fetched the lantern before it. He opened his mouth, closed it, then gave a short laugh. You would have made a terrifying governess, Miss Marple. Only to boys who had not done their preparation. He walked away before she could ask more. Inside the church, Reverend Seddon prepared for the ceremony. The bell rope hung in the nave, thick, worn, and newly examined by the police. A constable stood near the tower door. Inspector Graves had placed another outside. At 10 minutes to midnight, a stir ran through the crowd. Marion Fleck had appeared at the back of the church. Her plum cloak was gone. Her hair was untidy. She held one hand to her forehead and looked around as if she expected applause for surviving. Several women cried out. Reverend Seddon hurried towards her. Inspector Graves reached her first. Where have you been? I was taken, Marion said faintly. By whom? I do not know. It was dark. Someone came behind me in my cottage. A cloth over my face. I woke in an outbuilding, I think. I escaped when I heard voices. Which outbuilding? I cannot be sure. Inspector Graves looked down at her shoes. So did Miss Marple. They were clean. Not just dry, but clean. There was no mud at the hem of her skirt either, though the lanes beyond the churchyard were wet. Miss Marple's eyes softened with something like pity. Marion Fleck was frightened now, not acting frightened as she often did, but truly frightened. Whatever had happened, or whatever she had agreed to pretend, had gone beyond her control. At midnight, Reverend Seddon took the bell rope. The whole church held its breath. He pulled. Nothing happened. He pulled again, harder. Still nothing. The silence that followed was worse than the ringing had been. Inspector Graves moved at once. Tower door. The constable unlocked it. The inspector took a lamp and went up the narrow stair, followed by another officer. The villagers remained below, frozen in place. Minutes passed. Then Graves called down from above, his voice sharp. "The bell has been tied." A murmur spread through the church like wind through dry leaves. Miss Marple looked at the faces around her. Clara was trembling. Hugh looked trapped. The vicar seemed close to collapse. Marion stared at the rope with horror, and Mrs. Wren, standing near the aisle with her hands folded neatly before her, looked not frightened, not surprised, but angry. Miss Marple saw it for only a second before the expression disappeared. Inspector Graves came down, carrying a short length of dark cord. "Someone has been in the tower again," he said. Reverend Seddon whispered, "But why stop the bell now?" Miss Marple glanced towards Mrs. Wren's tightly folded hands. "Perhaps," she said, "because the first ringing told a lie, and the second might have told the truth." Chapter 7. The bell that would not speak. No one left the church at once. The villagers stood in uneasy clusters beneath the dark rafters, speaking in whispers though there was no service taking place. The lamps along the walls gave a soft yellow light, but the church itself seemed colder than it had before. The tied bell had frightened them more than the murder, Miss Marple thought. Murder was wicked, but it was human. A bell that rang when it should not, and then refused to ring when it should, felt almost personal. Inspector Graves ordered the doors watched. Then he turned to Reverend Seddon. "Who had permission to enter the tower tonight?" "No one except myself and Tom Brigg ordinarily, but Tom is in custody." The constable had the key. "And the spare key?" The vicar's tired face changed. "The spare key was removed yesterday after we discovered where it had been kept." "Removed by whom?" "By me. I gave it to Mr. Pritchard, the verger, for safety." Inspector Graves closed his eyes briefly, as if asking heaven for patience and receiving none. "Then I shall speak to Mr. Pritchard." Mr. Pritchard, a small elderly man who looked permanently apologetic, was found near the back pew. He admitted he had placed the key in the vestry drawer because his trouser pocket had a hole in it. "And was the vestry drawer locked?" asked Inspector Graves. Mr. Pritchard looked wounded. "It is the vestry, Inspector." "That is not an answer." "No," said Miss Marple gently, "but it is quite a common one. The key, when searched for, was still in the drawer." That proved very little. It might have been borrowed and returned, or the person who tied the bell had entered another way. Old churches, Miss Marple knew, often had as many secrets in their stones as old families had in their cupboards. Inspector Graves went up the tower again with 2 officers. This time he allowed Miss Marple to remain at the foot of the stair, though his expression made it clear that he was doing so against his better judgment. A few minutes later he came down carrying 3 objects wrapped in a handkerchief: a small iron hook, a length of dark cord, and the stub of a candle. "There," he said, hidden behind a beam. "I have seen enough parlour tricks now to open a theatre." Miss Marple studied the objects without touching them. "The candle was used before," she said. "To burn through a cord?" "Yes. If one ties the bell rope back and fixes the cord so that a candle slowly weakens it, the rope can be released after a delay. The bell rings when the murderer is elsewhere." "That explains the first ringing," Graves said. "But tonight the bell was tied so it could not ring at all. Which suggests tonight mattered to someone, or someone wanted more confusion. Confusion is useful only when it hides a direction." He looked at her sharply. "And what direction do you see?" "I see several people being pushed into view. Tom Brigg first, then Marion Fleck, possibly Hugh, perhaps even my poor Edith. Mrs. Lorimer." Miss Marple's face became grave. "We shall come to that, I think." The church was slowly emptied. Inspector Graves insisted that each person go straight home and remain available. This instruction was obeyed in the village manor. Everyone went home by the longest possible route, stopping 3 or 4 times to discuss the matter in low tones. Miss Marple and Edith walked back beneath a cloudy sky. Hugh had disappeared again, though Edith had pretended not to notice. "Jane," Edith said at last, "what did you mean about me? I hope nothing, dear. That is not comforting, no, but it is better than false comfort." At Edith's cottage, Miss Marple asked if she might look at the fireplace in the small morning room. Edith was bewildered, but led the way. The ashes had been cleared that afternoon by the maid, but the brass coal box beside the hearth still held a few half-burned scraps of paper. Miss Marple bent and picked one up carefully. Edith went pale. "What is it? A page from Marian Fleck's diary. Here? In my house? So it seems. I did not put it there." "I know." Edith sat down suddenly. "Jane, someone is trying to make it look as if I did." "Someone is trying to scatter suspicion like crumbs for birds," said Miss Marple. "The interesting thing is that the crumbs are always placed where people are expected to peck." The scrap contained only a few words. Mrs. B paid in silence. The rest was charred. Edith stared at it. "This is dreadful. Why would anyone put that here? Because I am staying here. If suspicion touches you, it touches me emotionally. A detective may be distracted by affection, just as an ordinary person may be." "You are not a detective." "No," said Miss Marple, "but murderers do not always make fine distinctions." The next morning brought another round of questioning. Inspector Graves gathered the principal people in the church hall. Clara Vale, Reverend Seddon, Hugh Lorimer, Marian Fleck, Mrs. Wren, Edith, Mr. Pritchard, and several committee members. Tom Brigg was still absent, though by now even Graves looked less certain of his guilt. Clara was the first to break. She stood where Anne asked about her uncle's desk key, and began bravely enough, but her voice soon failed. "I lied," she said. "Not about killing him. I did not. But I lied about the papers." Inspector Graves waited. "My uncle was blackmailing someone. I do not know who. He had letters tied in a red ribbon. After he died, I found them. I was afraid they would disgrace people, and I burned some before I understood what they meant." "Which people?" Graves asked. Clara shook her head. "There were no names on some, only initials. One was HL, one was PS, one was—" She stopped. "Go on," said Graves. "One was EW." Mrs. Wren's face did not move. "My initials," she said. "Ellen Wren." "There are many Wrens in England, Inspector," Miss Marple said mildly. "But not many Ellen Wrens in Bellwether St. Anne, who were connected with the festival accounts." Mrs. Wren turned to her. "You have a soft voice, Miss Marple, but you use it like a knitting needle in the ribs." "Knitting needles are much maligned," said Miss Marple. "They can be very useful." Inspector Graves asked Clara, "What did the letters say?" "I burned the EW one," Clara whispered. Mrs. Wren gave a short laugh. "Convenient." Clara flinched. "I am sorry." Hugh Lorimer, who had been leaning against the wall with forced carelessness, suddenly spoke. "This is absurd. Everyone wrote to Vale sooner or later. He was on every committee in the place and made everyone beg for favours." "Did you beg for one?" Graves asked. Hugh's colour rose. "I asked for a loan, and when he refused, I disliked him." "That is not murder." "No. But your aunt says you were not fetching a lantern when you claimed to be." Edith looked distressed. "I only said I could not remember clearly." Hugh gave a bitter smile. "Dear Aunt Edith, loyal even when confused." Miss Marple looked at him over her knitting bag. "You were not at the lantern stall, Mr. Lorimer. Mrs. Wren would have seen you, Mrs." Wren's eyes flickered. Hugh hesitated. "Very well, I went to meet Vale." A murmur went round the hall. "I was desperate," he said. "I had debts, stupid ones, cards, nothing criminal. I asked Vale again for help. He laughed at me." "When was this?" Graves asked. "Before the procession. Not when the bell rang. Before. He was alive when I left him." "Where did you meet?" "Behind the church near the north wall." Miss Marple remembered Tom Brigg's supposed position and said nothing. Reverend Seddon admitted next that Vale had threatened him over the church accounts. His voice trembled with shame. "It was a transfer between funds. I meant to restore it after the harvest donations. Alistair said he could make it look like embezzlement." Perhaps he could. He had a talent for making weakness look like wickedness. Marian Fleck then gave her account of the previous night. It was much less grand than before. She had not been struck unconscious. She had received a note telling her to keep quiet if she did not want the rest of her diary destroyed. She had gone to an old shed near the bakery, where she was locked in for several hours. "Why did you lie?" Inspector Graves asked. Marian looked smaller without her cloak. "Because I was ashamed. Because I thought everyone would laugh. Because I have talked so much about danger that when I was truly frightened, I made it sound more dramatic than it was." "That," said Mrs. Wren, "is the first believable thing you have said." Marian's eyes filled with tears. Miss Marple watched Mrs. Wren. The woman sat very upright, hands folded, face plain and hard. She looked like respectability carved from old wood, and yet there was a tiny burn mark on the edge of her right cuff. Not new, perhaps, not proof, but another small thing in a line of small things. The final piece came from Mr. Pritchard. He remembered seeing a figure near the vestry door shortly before the midnight ceremony. A woman, he thought, though he was not certain. "Which woman?" Graves asked. The poor man looked miserable. It was dark. She wore a shawl. Every woman in the hall seemed to stiffen. Mrs. Wren said, "Half the village owns a shawl." "Indeed," said Miss Marple. "That is why shawls are useful." Inspector Graves turned to her. "You have something in mind?" "Yes," said Miss Marple. "I think we are near the end." She looked around the hall, at Clara, frightened by the remains of her uncle's secrets, at Hugh, ashamed of his debts, at the vicar, weak but not wicked, at Marian, foolish and vain, but now humbled, at Edith, hurt by the thought of suspicion, and finally at Mrs. Wren, whose expression had become almost bored. "The old diary pages," Miss Marple said, "were not burned because the past mattered. They were burned to persuade us that it did." Marian stared. "But Agnes Pike may have been wronged, may have been loved, may have disappeared for reasons no one now living can prove. But she was not the reason Mr. Vale died." "Then what was?" asked Clara. Miss Marple folded her hands. "Money, my dear. Not a great fortune. That is what makes it so human. Small sums taken often. Small lies told for years, small resentments polished until they became sharp." Mrs. Wren rose abruptly. "I have cakes to prepare. If the police have finished wasting my morning—" "Not quite," said Inspector Graves. Mrs. Wren looked at him, then at Miss Marple. For the first time, the cake seller's certainty showed a crack. Miss Marple's voice remained gentle. "I think everyone should return here after breakfast tomorrow. There are one or two things that must be placed in their proper order." "And if I refuse?" Mrs. Wren asked. "Then," said Miss Marple, "I am afraid people may begin to wonder why, Mrs." Wren sat down again. Outside, the church tower stood pale against the morning sky. Its bell had rung falsely, then been silenced falsely, and now waited like a witness too old to care about human fear. Miss Marple looked up at it through the hall window. "I think," she said almost to herself, "the bell has been silent long enough." Chapter 8. Miss Marple Rings the Truth. The church hall was full before breakfast had properly ended. No one had been formally invited, yet everyone seemed to understand that something final was about to happen. In villages, news did not need legs. It travelled by curtains, kettles, milk jugs, and the tone in which one woman said good morning to another. Inspector Graves stood near the long committee table with his notebook closed. That, Miss Marple thought, was sensible. There were times when too much writing made people feel safer than they ought. Clara Vale sat in the front row, pale but composed. Hugh Lorimer stood at the back, no longer attempting charm. Reverend Seddon had the look of a man prepared to confess to anything merely to be allowed to sleep. Marian Fleck sat stiffly in a plain grey coat, her dramatic cloak absent. Edith Lorimer, deeply troubled but loyal, remained beside Miss Marple. Mrs. Wren arrived last. She wore her usual dark dress, her hair pulled back, her hands covered in clean white cotton gloves. She looked ordinary, capable, and faintly annoyed, as though the entire murder investigation had been an inconvenience to her baking schedule. Miss Marple noticed the gloves. So did Inspector Graves. "Mrs. Wren," he said, "thank you for coming. I was not aware I had a choice." "In murder cases," said Miss Marple gently, "choice is often the first thing people lose, Mrs." Wren gave her a hard look and sat down. Inspector Graves turned to the room. "Miss Marple has certain observations to make. I suggest everyone listens carefully." A murmur passed through the hall. Miss Marple rose slowly. She did not look like a person about to accuse anyone of murder. She looked like a gentle old lady about to discuss a parish jumble sale. "That," she began, "is often how wickedness survives, by appearing too ordinary to be noticed." No one moved. Mr. Alistair Vale was a proud and unpleasant man. That made the case difficult, because nearly everyone had a reason to dislike him. Tom Brigg had been threatened over his cottage. Reverend Seddon feared exposure over church accounts. Mr. Hugh Lorimer had debts. Miss Clara Vale was afraid of her uncle. Miss Fleck believed he was hiding old village history. Marion lifted her chin slightly. But dislike is not proof, nor is fear, nor is even a bad temper. The murderer needed 3 things: a private meeting with Mr. Vale, knowledge of the festival arrangements, and a way to appear safely elsewhere when the bell rang. Inspector Graves watched Mrs. Wren. She watched Miss Marple. "The bell was not rung by Mr. Vale," Miss Marple continued. "His hands were clean, though the rope was dusty. It was not rung by the murderer at the moment the village heard it. It was arranged beforehand. A cord, a hook, and a candle made a delayed mechanism. When the candle burned through the cord, the bell rope was released, and the bell rang." Reverend Seddon whispered, "So the murderer could be in the crowd." "Exactly," said Miss Marple. "Or, more precisely, at a stall in full view, serving cake." All eyes turned to Mrs. Wren. She did not flinch. "That is nonsense." "Not quite," said Miss Marple. "Nonsense is usually less tidy." Inspector Graves said, "Continue." "Mrs. Wren told us she was serving ginger loaf when the bell rang. That gave her an excellent alibi. But the first thing that troubled me was not what she said. It was what she did not smell of." Mrs. Wren's mouth tightened. "Smell? Yes. A person serving cakes all evening usually carries sugar, flour, spice, or lemon on her hands and cuffs. You had scrubbed your hands very thoroughly. Too thoroughly. Beneath the soap there was a faint smell of candle smoke. That proves nothing. Alone, no. But then there were the gloves. The gloves were found in Tom Brigg's shed." "Placed there," said Miss Marple. "Too neatly and with candle wax on them. Mr. Vale had worn them earlier. The murderer removed them after death, so his clean hands would not immediately betray the false ringing. But the gloves became dangerous evidence. They had to be hidden where suspicion already wished to go." Tom Brigg, who had been brought in from custody that morning and stood beside a constable, gave a low, angry sound. "I told you." "Yes," said Miss Marple kindly, "and you told us too loudly, which made people believe you less." Tom looked as if he wished to object, then thought better of it. Miss Marple turned back to the room. The old legend of Agnes Pike was useful, but it was never the true motive. The broken charm, the diary pages, the whispers at Clara's window, Miss Fleck's appearance. All these were smoke. Some of it was dramatic smoke, because Miss Fleck is inclined that way. Marion flushed, but did not speak. The diary pages were planted and burned to suggest that the old story mattered. The scrap placed in Edith's fireplace was meant to unsettle me by putting suspicion near a friend. Very clever, but also rather desperate. Edith looked at Mrs. Wren with hurt astonishment. "Mrs.," Wren said coldly, "you have a fine imagination." "I have lived in villages," said Miss Marple. "That is almost the same thing, but less comfortable." A faint nervous laugh passed through the hall and died quickly. Miss Marple's voice softened. Mr. Vale had discovered a theft. Not a grand theft, not jewels, not a fortune, not anything romantic. Small sums from the festival accounts over several years, donations not entered, stall takings reduced, candle money misplaced, cake money adjusted. Mrs. Wren's face became pale beneath its hardness. Clara whispered, "The red pencil marks in his account book." "Yes, my dear." Your uncle had begun checking the figures. He found what others had missed, because they trusted the person handling the small daily money. Inspector Graves opened his notebook now. Mrs. Ellen Wren was treasurer for the refreshment and candle stalls, and had been, for years, said Miss Marple, trusted because she was useful, trusted because she was plain-speaking, trusted because people mistake sharpness for honesty. Mrs. Wren stood. "I took nothing that was not owed to me." The words struck the room like a thrown stone. Inspector Graves said quietly, "Then you admit taking money?" "I worked for this village for 30 years. I baked, cleaned, arranged, carried, counted, stayed late, came early. Men like Alistair Vale stood on platforms and received thanks. Women like me washed the cups." "That may be true," said Miss Marple, "but bitterness is not a receipt." Mrs. Wren's eyes flashed. "He was going to ruin me, so you sent the note. I wanted to frighten him. You lured him to the church. He came because he thought he could frighten me." Her voice had lost its flatness now. It was rough with old anger. "He said he would expose me after the festival. In front of everyone. He smiled when he said it, and you struck him." Mrs. Wren was silent. Inspector Graves stepped forward. "With what?" Miss Marple answered. "The iron counterweight from the old cake stall awning, I think. Heavy enough, easily carried in a basket, and not noticed because Mrs. Wren was always carrying something." Mrs. Wren closed her eyes. "That was confession enough, but she spoke all the same. He should have left me alone." "No," said Miss Marple. "He should have been kinder. That is not the same thing." For a moment the only sound in the hall was Clara's quiet sob. Then Inspector Graves nodded to the constable. Mrs. Wren did not struggle when he came to her. She removed the white cotton gloves herself and placed them on the table, as if even now she could not bear to leave anything untidy. As she passed Miss Marple, she said, "You think yourself gentle?" Miss Marple met her eyes. "No. I think gentleness is something one must work at very hard, especially when one sees clearly." Mrs. Wren looked away. After she was taken out, the hall remained silent. No one seemed proud of having the truth. Truth, Miss Marple had often found, was not always pleasant when it arrived. It had a habit of bringing a great deal of human weakness with it. Tom Brigg was released with an awkward apology from Inspector Graves. Hugh confessed his debts to Edith and looked younger once he stopped, pretending not to be frightened. Reverend Seddon promised to place the accounts before the parish openly. Marion Fleck declared that she would write the true history of the festival, though Miss Marple privately hoped someone sensible would edit it. As for Agnes Pike, the old story remained uncertain. Perhaps she had been wronged. Perhaps she had run away. Perhaps the bell had once rung for her, or perhaps people had only needed to believe it had. The past, Miss Marple reflected, did not always give up its dead, but the present had spoken clearly enough. That afternoon Reverend Seddon rang the church bell once in remembrance of Alistair Vale. The sound rolled over Bellwether St. Anne, solemn and clean. No one cheered, no one whispered, they simply listened. Edith stood beside Miss Marple at the garden gate. "Will the festival continue next year?" she asked. "Oh, I expect so," said Miss Marple. "Villages are very fond of tradition, even when it has behaved badly." Edith smiled faintly. "And the silent bell?" Miss Marple looked towards the church tower. "Perhaps it will be silent for a better reason now." She reached into her knitting bag and drew out the small broken bell charm marked with the initials AP. "You kept it?" "Yes," said Miss Marple. "A little reminder of poor Agnes Pike." "Of silence," said Miss Marple. "It is not always innocence. Sometimes it is only waiting for someone brave enough to hear what lies beneath it." And above the village, the bell rested quietly in its tower. No longer a legend, no longer a trick, but simply a bell, which was, in Miss Marple's opinion, quite mysterious enough.
If you enjoy our story, then like, subscribe our channel.